Some questions? Yeah, there's a question. Yeah.
Go ahead, shout it out.
The biggest issue I have with blockchain is the double coincidence of wants. So you're pretty much saying that without a foreign exchange, you are able to use blockchain to make transactions between two people who may not necessarily want the exact same thing. So you're pretty much, so if I use a US dollar to buy, I don't know, this microphone, someone else will give me the microphone, and then that person can use the US dollars that I gave them to buy food that they put on their table. With blockchain, that isn't necessarily the case. So how do you make up for that?
So I would say two things. I liken, everybody here see The Matrix? I'm guessing, again, I'm a Stevens, everybody's seen The Matrix, right? So Bitcoin is like a lot like being inside the Matrix. It doesn't actually know about the outside world. It was only created to solve this problem of eliminating centralized trust. That's it, right? And the currency comes along for the ride. And they added a property, which they didn't need to do, which fixes the amount of the float. And that's all it does. With one exception. It has this idea of very simple smart contracts. Abra uses those smart contracts to solve the problem you're talking about by effectively giving you a hard line into the matrix to make it interoperable with the real world. But true cryptocurrencies themselves weren't designed to solve the problem you're talking about. They simply don't exist for that reason.
So then just a quick follow-up question. How do you get people on board with smart contracts? Because
that's really simple. They don't know that they're using them, right? So if I said in order to swipe a credit card, you have to know what an acquiring bank is, an issuing bank, how the network works, how transaction processes settle, nobody would swipe a credit card. So when you use Abra, you're holding a private key on a smartphone to dozens of smart contracts and have no idea that you're using them in the first place. Now, our terms of service outline the fact that they're synthetic assets, but so does Visa's processes outline what an acquiring bank is. You have to hide the complexity of this stuff to the consumer or it's not going to work.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if Bitcoins or any of these synthetic currencies and assets have any effect on inflation, like globally or nationally or in any market that they operate in?
Yeah, not yet. So they may over time, not inflation per se, but certainly liquidity and volatility. So if you think about, we just launched outside the US last week this new synthetic equity product. In English, that means that people in China, Russia, Indonesia can use our app to invest in the NASDAQ without actually having to register at a broker because they're holding effectively Bitcoin on the phone that's tied to the value of the Apple share. Now, in order to create that synthetic asset in the smart contract, Abra is acting as the counterparty to that contract, meaning we're taking the offsetting bets. I don't exist to speculate against consumers, so I have to hedge away that risk in real time, right? And so effectively I do that, it's way more complicated than this, but effectively I do that by borrowing shares. If I end up borrowing as many shares in the aggregate as like E-Trade manages on behalf of US buyers, right, I am driving massive liquidity in the marketplace. I'm actually have a governance issue as well because I'm probably holding $1 trillion worth of shares at that point. But over time, it could happen, but it's way too early to see. But it's definitely possible. There has to be, again, that hard line into the real world. And so if I'm giving you price exposure, somebody has to basically be making you whole if the price of Bitcoin moves against you. So like last year, for example, the price of Bitcoin, it was a perfect test. The price of Bitcoin fell 90%. We had lots of people holding dollars. That meant that contracts were giving them a lot more Bitcoin to get the value back up to where it was supposed to be. That Bitcoin was coming from Abra, but we didn't lose a penny because our system was perfectly hedged in the markets and worked exactly the way it was meant to be or way it was intended to work. So, I actually did a talk at MIT a couple of weeks ago on the mechanics of this. You can, if you do a search, MIT Barhydt, it's a 45-minute talk just on the mechanics of synthetic currency. It's a very complex topic.
Quick question there. How can the transaction costs associated with the cryptocurrency ecosystem be brought down, and how soon do you see that happening?
That's a great question. This is I spend a lot of time on this topic. So in addition to being the most inefficient transaction processing system ever created, it's also very expensive in terms of individual transaction costs. We were seeing transaction costs spike to literally $25 a transaction in December of 2017 when the price spiked. And if you're enabling Mexican immigrants to send $10 home, a $25 transaction fee is really not going to work very well. So there's a huge effort going on within the Bitcoin and Ethereum communities to address this kind of scaling challenge. If you actually look at their websites, there's basically a multi-part roadmap in the case of both. But basically what it comes down to is developing an analogous stack to the traditional banking system, but without the central trust. So in the banking world, we have the Fed, which creates the money, and then we have the banks that provide liquidity, and then we have the payment networks that manage the movement and the settlement of payments. We don't have that yet in the crypto world. So we're now developing what we call these layer 2 technologies. The most famous example is this project called Lightning, which adds a second layer on top of Bitcoin that can actually process transactions in theory at close to Visa scale, and then treats Bitcoin itself like a settlement layer, like a Fedwire would treat transactions via as a settlement layer. That's probably the most promising short-term solution that I've seen. The rest is a very long, complex academic discussion. But the most important answer is that there's a lot of academics working on this problem right now. And that's the beauty of the open source community. So as somebody who doesn't have a plan B, I'm highly encouraged that it's working. Yeah.
I was curious, how do you deal with, a lot of people are wary about cryptocurrency whenever they hear about hacking here, hacking there, and so a lot of people are very wary about that. How do you deal with that?
Yeah. Well, the first thing you do is you hide the complexity to the consumer, as we talked about before. The average Abra user has no idea that they're using public-private key cryptography and smart contracts. That's number one. And so that's by far the most important answer, and that's the consumer experience. But I would also say that there's an educational issue with understanding that all of the hacks have been people hacking exchanges, ironically. It's the central storage of keys. Taking a private key in a public-private key setting and putting it online is like the worst idea in the history of bad ideas. Right? It's orthogonal to the idea of cryptocurrency in the first place. Right? We say in my world, if you're not holding the keys, you're not holding the money. Right? And so with Abra, you're holding the key. I have no access. If the government comes to me and subpoenas your money because they think you're a bad actor, my response is, here's your phone number, I don't have the money. Right? That's the way to do it, because Bitcoin itself has never been hacked. The exchanges where people stupidly store the keys online have been hacked, and they will continue to be hacked. Right? The reason that Dropbox isn't hacked every day is people don't think there's anything of value there. Right? But if people believed all of a sudden that everybody was storing their Bitcoin keys on Dropbox, guess where the hackers would turn their attention? Right? The same place, for the same reason that they turn their attention to cryptocurrency exchanges. It's like fishing with a net. Sure.
First of all, a fascinating talk. Thank you so much. You talked about artificial intelligence as one of the 3 technologies that you're fascinated by and you pay special attention to. And you gave some examples of where we already use artificial intelligence. What is your view about areas where, let's say in the next 10 years, AI is going to have the most profound impact in the way we live and do business?
Yeah. I'm particularly excited about healthcare and education, right? So the ability to do remote diagnosis for people living in areas where the ratio of doctors to humans is significantly lower, in developing markets in particular. We're less than 5 years away from basically being able to do that via remote smartphone tricorder type of scenario. And then the second is in distance learning and also in remote areas where you can basically have interactive learnings that simulate a real student-teacher-like experience, but using an AI bot-like environment. Those are 2 examples of recent developments that I've been paying a lot of attention to that I'm really excited about.
Any of us will be out of job.
I think that's true for every area example I gave you today. So,
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Bill, for this fascinating lecture. And to commemorate your lecture and your visit to Stevens, I'd like to present you with a plaque.
You see?
Oh,
Oh,
yes,
wow.
yes, you
All
can
right.
read it. Yes. Absolutely.